up the Virtual Commerce Club right now. And as we do, as you know, we're loading on about 100 people today for the presentation. So we kind of let that process for a minute or two. So I'm going to kind of stall a little bit as we bring you on board virtually. But we're happy to have you here. It's kind of nice to not go anywhere on a day like today, but to have access to a world-class expert in vaccination. So we're very pleased to have Dr. Sostman with us today. I think that's probably what we need to load people on. I think they'll be coming on as we go. Again, I'm Bill Deal, the president of the Greater Houston Port Bureau. And this is our Commerce Club, which is virtual right now. We do this every second Thursday of the month, and we welcome you. We kind of rotate between government and regulators and business people to give our audience a good variety of what's going on out there. As you probably are aware, you are in the listen-in mode. You do have the ability to ask questions at the bottom of the screen. There's a chat button, a Q&A button, and you can ask a question. And if you see someone else ask a question that you think would be interesting to you, please upvote it, and we'll prioritize the questions when we get to them based on the interest in the questions. So Dr. Sostman's going to talk for a little bit, and then he'll take questions. Before I introduce him, I do want to recognize our sponsors that make this possible for us. Enterprise Product Partners, the Houston Pilots, the Houston Marriott Hobby Airport Hotel, Intercontinental Terminal Company, Kinder Morgan, Moran Shipping Agencies, Regions Bank, Targa Resources, and the West Gulf Maritime Association. So thank you to those companies for supporting us with this. We're very pleased to have Dr. Sostman with us today. He's the chairman of the Houston Methodist Vaccine Scientific Advisory Committee. If you get a chance to read his bio, it is quite impressive. People throw around expert a lot, and I'm cautious on that, but when I read his bio, we do have a world-class expert with us today, and we're privileged that he's taken the time to share that expertise with us. He is originally from New York City, graduated medical school at Yale, served as a faculty member there, and also at Duke, Weill Cornell, and Houston Methodist. He is an accomplished radiologist with over 20 years of clinical experience and was recognized as one of the best in America. He's complemented that clinical experience with extensive research and authored over 200 original publications. We're very pleased to have him at this point when the vaccine's being rolled out so that everyone knows what the lay of the land is. And so, Dr. Sostman, I'm going to turn it over to you to start your presentation.
Okay, thank you, Bill, for that very kind introduction. I'm going to start sharing my screen now. And of course, I take the expert designation with a lot of humility because, you know, basically a year ago, none of us had ever heard of this disease. So we're all learning as we go along. Bill, can you see my screen okay?
It is good. Yes, you're all set.
Good. So I'm going to talk mostly about vaccines, but basically the thrust of the presentation is that the immune system can be used or relied upon in a variety of ways to fight COVID. Kind of fundamental to this discussion is the fact that previous infection with COVID does protect you against getting it again. And antibodies are the easy thing to measure in immunity. Cell-mediated immunity is a lot harder, so we rely on antibody measurements. And also, it's really neutralizing antibodies that will give you so-called sterilizing immunity that prevents you from passing on an infection to another person. So antibodies are important. And fortunately, studies are showing, and I'm just showing you two here, both from England, that the antibody status is a good prediction of protection against infection. So in the left-hand panel here is the Oxford Health System study where they followed 12,000 healthcare workers for 6 months. Healthcare workers are very convenient subjects because they're available and they're heavily exposed in general. And back in early on in the pandemic, they measured everybody's antibody levels. And after about July, the initial high level of antibodies was related to the first surge here. If you look at the red curve, that is the cumulative infections in people who were antibody negative at baseline. And the blue curve is the cumulative infections in those who were antibody positive. And obviously the protective value of the antibodies was about 89%. A larger study done by throughout England, not just in the Oxford region, looked at 20,000 healthcare workers. And they also did antibody and PCR testing on a regular basis. Those who did not have antibodies when the study started, compared to those who did, those without antibodies were much more likely to acquire the infection during the course of the study. Those who with antibodies were 83% less likely to become reinfected. And if they did, they were way less likely to have symptoms. So not only protection from infection at all, but also if infection did occur, protection from the more severe forms. However, they did find that even people who did have antibodies occasionally did carry high levels of the virus, and therefore they could transmit that to others. So let's just look at it in a very simple way and say, so if antibodies are protective, how do we get people to have antibodies without going through COVID-19 infection? So one way is to generate the antibodies in a lab or a pharma fabrication facility in the form of monoclonal antibodies and inject them into people. This was done in 2 studies, one sponsored by Eli Lilly, one by their Regeneron company. And that led to emergency use authorization by the FDA for monoclonal antibody infusions in mild to moderate COVID-19. And the whole idea here was find high-risk people who are infected and see if you can keep them out of the hospital, see if you can modulate the course of the disease so that mild COVID doesn't then turn into severe COVID and end up with people in the hospital. And these early studies showed about a 2/3 reduction in the rate of hospitalization in folks who were positive for SARS-CoV-2, and also either because of age or coexisting comorbid conditions at high risk for progression to severe disease. Now, they also did studies in people who were already in the hospital, and those unfortunately showed not much efficacy. And this, I think, goes along with the really kind of biphasic nature of this disease, where the viremic phase, where you're carrying a lot of virus in your tissues, is relatively brief, and the more severe parts of the disease tend to be related to dysregulated immunity and dysregulated immune responses, which you would not expect monoclonal antibodies to affect. But we have found this in our Houston Methodist practice to be very effective. It takes a little setting up because it involves an hour-long infusion and you have to monitor people for allergies and so forth. But we're doing about 400 infusions a week, and the results have been excellent. we've had, out of the total of more than 2,500 people that we've infused, only one fatality, which is way less than you would expect in this demographic. So very well tolerated, very safe, and very effective. Some more recent data, tends to be along the same line. One study was done in nursing home residents to use a monoclonal infusion in people who do not have COVID and see if it's a way of creating a sort of a passive immunization. And indeed, they showed an 80% reduction in symptomatic infections after the infusions. And in this study, there were 41 people who did have COVID at the start of the study. And in the monoclonal group, none of them died, compared with 20% mortality rate in the placebo group. Another study was done with a dual monoclonal antibody cocktail, showing basically similar results. And the important part here is that you all are familiar with these viral variants. The dual antibody infusions appear to be very effective at suppressing these variants, which the single antibodies may not be. Another passive immunization approach was in the household contacts of folks who were infected with COVID. Basically 100% prevention of symptomatic infection in people who cohabit with the sick people. Did not prevent asymptomatic infection, but people did not know that they had it. So that's one way of using the immune system, kind of passive immunity or passive treatment, but obviously active immunization with vaccines is going to be more generalizable and potentially more effective, because it also recruits the cell-mediated portion of the immune system. So let's look at what's out there and what is on the runway. And there are, as you know, 2 approved vaccines made by Pfizer and Moderna. Johnson & Johnson has submitted their data to the FDA. It will be reviewed on the 26th of this month. Based on the phase 1 and phase 2 data, we expect it to be approved by the Vaccine Advisory Committee, likely a couple of days later by the FDA, and then reviewed and approved by the ACIP committee of the CDC a week or so later. So we're looking for this vaccine to be available sometime in March. What I hear is that they don't have a lot of doses yet, but they should have a pretty good supply later in the spring. Then there are 2 others, the AstraZeneca vaccine, which is approved in Europe, and the Novavax vaccine, which probably will be the next one in the US. So how do these protect you? Well, let's look at what kind of protection are we talking about. Are we talking about this sterilizing immunity, where basically the virus cannot get a foothold in your body? Or are we talking about protection from symptomatic illness, where you can get infected with the virus, but it either is just totally not noticeable, or perhaps very, very mild? Or are we talking about protection from severe illness and then hospitalization or dying from COVID-19? So we'll look at each one of these individually. Asymptomatic infection, we don't have a lot of data because it's really pretty onerous to test people in large numbers over and over and over again. And anybody who's had these nasal swabs knows they're not very pleasant. A lot of work has been done in monkeys, where they immunize the monkey with the vaccine and then spray some COVID into their nose. And the Pfizer, Moderna, and Johnson & Johnson vaccines all appear to prevent infection, which would be kind of the best news you could have. The AstraZeneca vaccine prevents symptoms in the monkeys. They're perfectly happy, but they do have live virus in their nasal passages. And we don't know about Novavax. Well, let me go back there. In humans, the data is really scanty, but it looks like the AstraZeneca vaccine does actually work in preventing asymptomatic infection in humans, as does the Moderna vaccine, but at a reduced level of effectiveness. Protection from symptomatic disease, obviously the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, 95%. This is really almost as good as it gets in vaccines. Measles vaccine is about 98%. Flu vaccines typically about 50%. J&J is lower efficacy for protection from symptomatic illness. And if you look at the difference between the protection in the US, South America, and South Africa, those other regions where there are purportedly more resistant variants of the virus, it does look like the vaccine is effective, but at a somewhat reduced level against some of these newly emerging variants. The AstraZeneca vaccine, on the other hand, looks good in the United Kingdom, so it's good against that B117 variant, but does not seem to have dealt very well with the South African variant of the virus. And as you know, this has caused a big kerfuffle. The South Africans have put on hold their plans to use this vaccine. They've got millions of doses that they've bought that they're not sure what to do with right now. So that's a problem. The Novavax vaccine looked quite effective in the UK, less so in South Africa, but certainly it would clear the bar for FDA approval here, which is about 50%. I will say that no one has looked at the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines in a large clinical trial in some of these more challenging environments like South Africa. So they could be looking, if you will, artificially good. The good news with all these vaccines is the protection from severe disease appears to be extremely high. And really, that is going to be one of the touchstones, keeping people from getting really sick, keeping them out of the hospital, and protection from hospitalization or death is essentially perfect with all of these vaccines. Again, as we'll discuss later, we don't know what the ultimate story with the variant viruses is going to be, but so far these vaccines are looking really good at protecting people from the most severe outcomes. And the whole issue of protecting people from being contagious is, I would say, promising, but still up in the air. So how's this looking in the real world? That's all clinical trial data. We don't have a lot of data from the real world, but here is Israel, which has vaccinated about 50 to 55% of its population. And if you look at these green bars up at the top of the slide, they have little red caps on them, which represents the number of infected people. And the vaccinated group is about 0.06% of the total group got infected, whereas unvaccinated is way larger than that. So 96% protection in the real world from the Pfizer vaccine, very consistent with the clinical trials. Here's some data from the Houston Methodist workforce, healthcare workers. The turquoise stair step here is kind of cumulative vaccinations. So we vaccinated, at the time of this slide, which was 2 weeks ago, about 19,000 people, which is about 70% of our workforce. We're up to close to 80% now. And you can see that our percentage of positive COVID-19 tests, and this is a mixture of random surveillance. We do have a random surveillance program, and also employees who present to employee health with symptoms that require ruling out COVID. You can see that our percentage of positive tests is basically mirroring, it's like the inverse of the vaccination rate. So we think this is highly suggestive evidence that the vaccines are working in our real life situation. Safety, I found that the news media either portray these vaccines as utterly perfect things that are going to save humanity, or they focus on the very rare, issues of safety or vaccine deniers or that sort of thing. Not a lot of balance there. What you can rely upon is that a lot of people who get the vaccines will get these sort of flu-like symptoms that are called reactogenic effects, injection site pain, fever, muscle aches, that sort of thing. Those are not a bug, they're a feature. That is evidence of activation of the innate immune system, and may actually correlate with a better response to the vaccine. The one thing that was not seen in the clinical trials that has been seen in the actual real-world deployment has been a small number of severe allergic reactions. It's very unclear what's going on with these, whether they are anaphylaxis or not, exactly what the mechanisms are. They're mostly seen in women. They typically occur very early, about 90% within the first half hour. They are quite unusual. A little bit more common with Pfizer, and a couple times more common than you will see with similar reactions to the seasonal flu vaccine. They're very treatable with epinephrine. No one has been reported to die of these. And so really, we do not use a history of allergy in general as a contraindication to vaccination. If somebody has one of these reactions to the first dose, we don't, of course, give them a second dose. And if they are known to be allergic to either some of the buffers or the some of the things that like PEG or polysorbate 80 that they use to condition the lipid nanoparticles, we would not vaccinate them either. If people express concern to me, I would say really nobody has died from these vaccines. About 450,000 Americans have died from COVID-19. You do the math. It's way more than 1,000 times safer to get vaccinated than it is to get COVID-19. So that's actually a pretty, to my way of thinking, a pretty optimistic story about the vaccines. But obviously, you got to wonder about what could go wrong. And probably the big thing, aside from some of the logistical challenges that we're having in producing and distributing the vaccines, which are being worked out, is this issue of the sudden appearance of a lot of viral variants that spread in the population. I mean, the graph here shows the exponential growth and spread of this 117 variant in the UK. which is now basically the dominant strain in the UK. We do have some cases of that here in Houston. We are a couple weeks behind on our genome sequencing, and we don't know exactly where it stands now. We had very few cases at the end of January, but it spreads fast, and probably this will become the dominant infection in America. That's actually kind of good news because it's really rather susceptible to the vaccines and the monoclonal antibodies compared to some of the others. So the issue is, we know the coronavirus mutates rather slowly. Unlike influenza, for example, it does have an error checking mechanism in its genetic replication. The problem is there are so darn many people out there with infections. Every person is like a living cell culture flask, growing virus. And the more virus that's out there growing, even if it's genetically relatively stable, the more mutations you're going to get. And of course, resistance to vaccines and monoclonal antibodies is the big concern. The whole issue is that as the spike protein, which is really the main antigenic target of the virus, as that generates more and more changes, it's going to start to be unrecognizable to antibodies that were trained with the original version. As I said, the good news on the UK variant, which is looking like it will probably become the normal strain here in America in the next couple of months, is that all of the current vaccines look like they handle this variant quite well. What is going to happen when it starts getting exposed to that antibody selective pressure is a concern. And of course, the South African strain does look like it is more resistant to the current vaccines, although still within the range where they could be efficacious and probably, again, will be protective against severe disease. But this one is really very concerning. So in terms of future projections, it's not clear yet exactly how big a problem the current variants are. Most of the data that's out there is very artificial laboratory studies. It's clear that some of these variants have the potential to upend the immunity from either pre-existing infection or vaccination. And so it's really very important for people to take all the protective measures and for us to get the population vaccinated ASAP. It does seem that over time, the mutations in this spike protein will require updated boosters. This happens with influenza when the new strain of flu is about 8 times less sensitive to the old vaccine. It's probably going to be something like that with COVID. One of the big problems we have here in America is that there is very little surveillance of COVID mutations. I think our program at Houston Methodist is probably the biggest one in Texas, certainly in Houston. And we're just one hospital. We can't do as many surveillance testing as really ought to be done. The good news is that particularly the messenger RNA technology and also the viral vector technology are really easy to update. I mean, the whole thing can be done in a few months. But I would say, and I think most people are starting to agree with this, that at least for the next several years, we're going to have to get annual COVID boosters. Probably over time, as the pandemic dies away and the endemic spread of COVID becomes, less of a problem, it may be possible to eliminate this or space out the intervals. And ultimately, maybe in 20 or 30 or 50 years, COVID will just become a mild childhood illness. So how's things looking? J&J should be approved by early March, AstraZeneca and Novavax in late spring, early summer. So by the summertime, we ought to have tons of vaccine. The logistics are getting better. It is not at all a stretch to think that we could have half the adult population vaccinated by summertime, 3/4 by the end of the year. And remember, probably 20 or 25% of the adult population in America has already been infected. So put those together and you should have a relatively well immunized population. If that all happens, by fall, life is going to look pretty darn good. Kids will be in school pretty normally. We can go to restaurants. We can get together socially. Colleges and pro sports can resume. It's not going to be exactly like life was in 2019. There will undoubtedly be local outbreaks. As I said, we'll probably have to get annual booster shots. Probably masks are going to be an issue for a long time. So let me just talk for a minute about winter. Obviously, it's less of a problem here, but coronaviruses like winter. And you probably know that there are 4 coronaviruses that circulate normally in the population. They cause about 20% of the common colds. They can be devastating and fatal to the elderly and compromised hosts. And one of them is HCoV-53 is very strongly suspected of having been passed from cattle to humans in the late 19th century, where it probably caused a pandemic very similar to COVID-19. But anyway, coronaviruses like winter. They like winter because of a whole host of factors that would be in a whole nother talk. But there's many reasons why respiratory viruses tend to predominate in the winter. So if you want to tell your employees some things to do, first off, the masks, the hand hygiene, and the social distancing are extra important in cold, dry conditions. I know everybody's tired of all this stuff, and I know that masks in particular are somewhat politicized. But man, I got to tell you, masks work. Why do you think there's no influenza this year? Well, sure, a lot more people have gotten flu shots because they got sort of scared straight. But mostly it's the masking and the hand hygiene. And personally, I'm planning to wear a mask in the flu season from now on. I could give you a whole talk on masks, but take it from me, they work. We're lucky in Houston, we can spend time outdoors. So I recommend people go out for walks, play golf, whatever you do. Spend a lot of time outdoors. Instead of going to a restaurant, have a picnic in the park. When you're indoor and your companies should have control over their building environment. We do, and we modified our temperature and relative humidity ranges to be about 72 F and 50% RH. That is the conditions under which the virus survives in the air or on surfaces the least. Ventilate indoor spaces and use air filters. People who are vitamin D deficient should get supplements. If you have normal levels of vitamin D, and this is something any primary care doctor can order this lab test. Normal levels, there's no point in taking supplements; they don't help. But there's a lot of data out there suggesting that vitamin D supplementation in folks who are deficient can help with immune status. Sleep, flu vaccine, and COVID vaccine are also really key tips for winter. So I think that's the end of the talk, and
Okay.
we'd be happy to take questions.
Yeah, we have about 10 minutes, so that was great overview. I'm just going to rifle through the questions real quick. Some of them you've answered, but maybe they want a little bit more definition on it. The first one is, I've heard that blood type O minus is less susceptible to the virus. Is there any truth to this?
There's been several papers on this suggesting that type O is somewhat protected and type A is somewhat more at risk. The data is very conflicting. Some studies show that, some studies do not show it. If there's an effect, it's probably quite small.
Okay. This question comes up. So I go get the vaccine, and then am I able to carry it and infect other people? And then two parts, am I able to get the virus again? Okay,
great questions. And if you've gotten fully vaccinated, can you nevertheless acquire the virus, carry it around in your nose, and if you sneeze on somebody, can you infect them? And the answer is we really don't know definitively the answer to that question. I'm guessing based on the non-human primate challenge experiments and also on some of the very, very fragmentary human data, that you're going to be somewhat protected against infection and transmissibility, but probably less than, against getting symptomatic disease. So if, the Moderna data suggested that they were 94% effective at preventing symptomatic disease and about 66% against preventing asymptomatic infection. And my guess would be that that's kind of how it's going to turn out.
So basically, I could have like minor flu symptoms, but I'm not going to go full-blown COVID, and the chances of me spreading it are slight.
Well, I don't know if slight is the right term, but less than of getting it yourself. Yeah.
Okay. A question here is, if I get the first dose of Moderna or Pfizer and cannot locate a second one, can I do the Johnson & Johnson? Or can you mix the two, or do you have to follow if you get Pfizer, you have to 3 weeks later get Pfizer, or 4 weeks later get Moderna or whatever?
Yeah, it's a great question, and really a really important question because of all those issues with logistics and different vaccine availability. Kind of the official answer is if you start with Pfizer, get your second dose with Pfizer. If you start with Moderna, get your second dose with Moderna, if at all possible. And the reason for that is the first dose kind of wakes up your immune system, and the second dose really trains it. And so you'd like that training dose to be similar as possible to the initial dose.
Okay.
But there are some people who believe that actually what's called a heterologous prime boost could end up being more effective. And there's some studies going on in England right now that aim to answer that question. So stay tuned.
So let me go back to your larger presentation. So what I got out of it was, we're getting vaccinated. We know what the strain is. The race is really against the mutation. So what may come out of Africa is what we got to get ahead of, because if it lands here, the vaccine may not cover it, and we may have to get another vaccine to address that mutation. Is that sort of the lay of what we're racing against?
Yeah, that's exactly what we're racing against. And what paradoxically, I'm actually hoping that the United Kingdom strain gets established here. because it looks like it may be more transmissible than the South African strain. And if that happens, it could outcompete the South African strain and keep it suppressed. And since it's kind of susceptible to the vaccines, that may give us enough time to get everybody in America fully vaccinated.
So let's say the US rolls out and we get all our vaccines. The question is, what about vaccine to Mexico or to third world? So even if the administration rolls out all these vaccines, we're still going, the world is not going to be vaccinated. So COVID is still going to be flying into our airports.
Yeah, that's another great question. And you know, looking at the supply, you know, you could, you know, unless we boost the supply and get these other countries vaccinated, you know, current rates, you could look at 7 or 8 years before the rest of the world is fully vaccinated. And it's not only just flying into our airports, it's also, you know, what kind of new mutants are brewing out there and all those infected people. So yeah, it's a big worry.
Okay. So when you showed the chart and it said Moderna, Pfizer, and Johnson & Johnson, if I went to the store, I'd say, I want the Moderna because that looks like the best. And you're like, well, all we got is Johnson & Johnson. It was a one-shot deal. What do you say to someone that says, no, I want Pfizer or Moderna?
I would get the first vaccine you can get.
Okay.
The sooner you're protected, the better. There's no reason that, you know, like if in the fall there's vaccine, you know, in every pharmacy and you can just walk in and get a shot of whatever you want. There's no reason you couldn't go in and get 2 shots of Pfizer in September.
So, okay, so now we get, you know, just to close out, just the expectation going forward is we're in the race against the mutations. We get ahead of it. We still know they're going to be in the world. They're still going to come in. And the expectation is just like the flu, we're going to go get an annual shot, which will address any variances that we can see. But the variant shots are going to be easier to do than even the flu, because the flu is kind of like they guess what the flu is going to be and then try and do it. Whereas it sounds like the COVID thing you said, within 6 weeks, we can dial up exactly what we need. Did I hear that right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. The problem with the flu is the lead time to produce the vaccines is so long. You kind of got to guess what the variant is going to be. With the COVID vaccines, you can do the sequencing, and in probably 6 or 7 weeks, you can engineer a new vaccine. At least the first couple of years, the FDA is going to require some clinical studies. So that's probably going to add a few months. But yeah, the cycle time is going to be much shorter.
Okay. Well, I think that's what we have time for. We try and close it up at 45 minutes to respect your time and the people that have joined us. We really appreciate your expertise. We are going to make your slides available to everyone, and we're going to record this, obviously, and put it on our website to get the information out. I think it's very valuable to the community, and we appreciate you taking time to share that with us.
My pleasure. Happy to help.
All right. As I close up our Virtual Commerce Club, I just do the plug for next month, which is Thursday, March 11th. We will feature Vincent DeCosmo. He's the first vice president of the Port Bureau and a senior vice president with Target Resources. And what he's going to do is update us on the funding options being considered to expedite the Houston Ship Channel Deepening and Widening Project, known as Project 11. We're getting a lot of questions on what it is, and we feel it is very important to this project is to the region, because the decision made now of whether to deepen and widen or expedite that deepening and widening will be a decision that we will live with for decades. So we've asked him to come forward and say, here's what we're looking at to expedite the funding. This is what everyone can expect, and sort of share that information now so we can have a dialogue. So pencil it in, March 11th. You want to hear It is the crucial decision for decades for whether your industry invests or not in this area to some degree to understand what our infrastructure may look like and when that infrastructure will be available. Again, we've been recording. We will send out the slides next week. Thank you for joining us. That concludes our webinar today. Have a great day.